Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome back to New Books in Intellectual History. I'm your host, Stephen Dozman. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger's influence over the last several decades of philosophy is undeniable, but his place in the canon has been called into question in recent years in the wake of the publication of private journals kept throughout his life, including during his involvement with the Nazi Party. This has led to a renewal of an intense series of debates about the relationship between Heidegger's thought and his politics, and the broader implications this relationship may have for philosophy more broadly. Diving into some of these discussions is my guest today, Adam Knowles, here to discuss his recent book, Heidegger's Fascist Affinities, A Politics of Silence, from Stanford University Press in 2019. Combining both philosophical and cultural analysis, the book argues that Heidegger's philosophy of language and his interest in Greek philosophy left him open to some of the reactionary currents that were active in his own time, and that his intellectual orientations left him with an easy path into Nazism. But beyond studying Heidegger in isolation, this book wants to use Heidegger as a gateway to understanding some of the deeper problems that may plague philosophy today. For given how far his influence reaches, the size of the shadow demands we try to be vigilant about potential blind spots. Adam Knowles completed his PhD at the New School for Social Research and is an assistant teaching professor of philosophy at Drexel University. So, Adam Knowles, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so we always like to have guests introduce themselves at the beginning. So could you tell us a bit about who you are and what your work and research tends to focus on?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm currently assistant professor at Drexel University. Beyond publishing this work, I'm also completing a translation of Heidegger's Black Notebooks, the private journals you just mentioned, from the years 1942 to 1948. That hopefully should be out by next year. And I'm also working broadly on themes relating to philosophy and fascism, and mostly around the question of how the humanities respond to authoritarian regimes, with Heidegger as a particular example, but German philosophy more broadly speaking as a broader example.
Excellent. So to dive into the book, one of the key themes or motifs that runs through your book is what you call Heidegger's seigetics, which you argue is a key for understanding both his philosophy and his politics and how the two relate. So to kick things off a bit, can you give us a sense of what you mean by this?
Yeah, so seigetics is derived from the Greek word sige, which is often translated as silence. And it generally refers to a silence produced by humans, as opposed to, say, a celestial silence or silence emerging from something, from some natural object. And Heidegger begins to, I would say, overtly develop a philosophy based around the question of silence already early in the 1920s. It's quite prevalent in his readings of Christian thinkers and his early lectures in the 1920s. It plays an important role in his 1927 magnum opus, Being and Time. And as the decades turn from the late 1920s to 1930s, silence and a broad range of things about unsaying and non-saying, and the limits of language, the limits of philosophical concepts, begins to take on a more and more important role in his thinking. And most importantly, he seeks to develop a set of concepts, but also a practice of philosophical silence for how he can maintain what he considers to be unsayable in a certain form of unsayability. This is a long tradition going back to Platonic thinking, where the good is unsayable, it's unspeakable, it brushes up against the limits of language. And there's a long sort of history of this, what Heidegger calls seigetic questions within the history of philosophy, that are involve not only the degree to which philosophical language can capture concepts, but also the limits of where philosophical language has to turn to different modes of expression, turn to maybe poetic modes of expression, and move away from the more aggressive forms of conceptuality that might be associated with modern logic, for example. So silence, after Being in Time, I argue in my book, is the dominant theme and the dominant mode of expression in Heidegger's thinking after being in time.
One of the first things you engage with is Heidegger's Völkisch sensibilities. But before unpacking how they work in his own thought, you give us some context in much German cultural analysis, since the Volk, or people, has a very specific meaning in the context Heidegger was engaging in. So can you give us a sense of this background? How did the Germans understand themselves in relationship to their surroundings, and how did more contemporary phenomena, such as urbanization, industrialization, and the like, fit into this worldview? And how did Volkisch thinking function in the intellectual milieu of the Weimar era?
Yeah, that's obviously a very complex question with many different parts to it. So let me just try to begin as broadly as possible. The folkish movement, as it's often called, has its roots going back to the 19th century. There's much wonderful intellectual historical research on the origins of this movement, but it becomes particularly crystallized in the post-World War I years, where there's a sense of sort of German defeat, German failure, a disillusionment in a certain way, and simultaneously resurgent nationalism, which is, of course, a resurgent nationalism that is overtly and pungently anti-Semitic, often overtly so, but often, let's say, more implicitly so. So in the 1920s, there's, in the Weimar era, in the era of the Weimar democracy, there's this very broad spectrum of thinkers and modes of thinking that loosely we can categorize as the folkish movement. It's the term itself is more or less sort of a subsequent label that's been used to apply to the movement, but it captures an incredibly broad range of often minor journals, often esoteric concerns. It, in its more mystical versions, it sees the German people as an ordained, providentially chosen people who is bound to its landscape through its language. And there's often it's combined with a sort of chauvinistic sense of German superiority, that there's an essential link to, let's say, its own belonging that no other people can possess in its most extreme version. And one of the things that, as we've begun to learn more and more about Heidegger's reading practices in the 1920s, in 2015, a set of letters between Martin Heidegger and his brother Fritz Heidegger were published. And in this, Heidegger himself, Martin Heidegger, that is, documents many of his reading practices from the 1920s. And this is a side of his biography and a side of his thinking that we didn't necessarily know a lot about. It was the sources that could document Heidegger's reading practices in the 1920s were not yet in publication. So through these letters, we began to see Heidegger, confessing to his brother, and even pressuring his brother to let's say, indulge in and familiarize himself with this broad range of folkish work that Heidegger's dealing with. And it's important to understand that this isn't just sort of a fringe movement. It's a well-established academic movement within the discipline of philosophy which Heidegger flirts with to a certain degree, and distances himself with to a certain degree. The more one knows about Heidegger's politics, he always sort of makes this double movement of approaching a particular form of thinking, but also simultaneously distancing himself from it, almost as if he's setting up alibis to give plausible deniability. So in the 1920s, he's closely reading a number of not only folkish philosophical thinkers, but popular literature, pulp novels by thinkers like Hans Grimm. And this overlooked aspect, I would say, ties together a lot of themes in Heidegger's thinking involving the question of language, questions of silence, obviously the question of the people, the folk, and also their belonging. So terms that are prevalent already in works like Being in Time, they begin to increasingly take on a different political valence in the late 1920s and early 1930s. There's a set of what I call affinities based on the title of the book, that Heidegger expresses a close affinity to certain aspects of the folkish movement, but often, let's say, puts it into an ontological guise. So I think it's fair to say that he's a folkish thinker. This is not necessarily new to my book. Pierre Bourdieu, for example, is almost 50 years ago had encouraged us to read Heidegger along the folkish movement. But it was often, let's say, regarded as so tawdry and so non-academic that there was often sort of a willingness among Heidegger scholars to distance Heidegger from this, let's say, disavowed school of thinking, the folkish thinking. But I think we learn quite a lot about Heidegger's political evolution by reading him as a folkish thinker.
One of the key elements of this particular orientation is the way anti-Semitism fits into it. Putting Heidegger in the context of a number of other Volkisch thinkers, you write, quote, "What all these thinkers have in common, although they vary in the degree to which they state this explicitly, is a perception of Jews as a disturbing element that destroys the essential harmonious silence that binds the German people to itself, to its landscape, and to its language." So can you unpack this a bit and explain how anti-Semitism fits into this worldview?
Yeah, so it's when the Black Notebooks were published, beginning in 2013, 2014, one of the initial readings of Heidegger's anti-Semitism was that he had invented what was called ontological anti-Semitism, that he'd given a philosophical, metaphysical, ontological valence to anti-Semitism. And one of the reasons why I think it's important to look at Heidegger as a folkish thinker is that we can find this ontological anti-Semitism prevalent in the 1920s. And it involves a sort of basic ontological duality of the German people bound together essentially within their language and within their place. But the German language, for example, according to certain strands of folkish thinking, emerges from the landscape and could only emerge from the landscape, the particular German landscape, the German characteristics of reticence, of hardiness, name all the stereotypes you might want to think about Germans, that emerges from the landscape. It's that the landscape gives rise to a particular set of traits that are in fact, say, the ontological essence of the German people. And the element of anti-Semitism that is certain thinkers, let's say, implicitly gesture to, and certain thinkers overtly endorse, is the duality of the gathered, connected German people in their essence, and the so-called dissevering or scattering influence of outsiders, the most important outsider being Jews, particularly assimilated Jews living within German society, according to the anti-Semitic discourses, as a sort of hidden polluting element that destroys German thinking and German language and German connection to the landscape from within. That it's a sort of secret enemy that attempts to hide itself in order to lead the German people to their own self-destruction. This is a well-established folkish discourse going back, at the latest, going back to the 19th century. But when we begin to see, we learned a lot about Heidegger's anti-Semitism with the publication of the Black Notebooks. He was incredibly careful about how he expressed himself in public, and the sources for documenting his anti-Semitism were sparse. We had passing references that were clearly anti-Semitic. But what we learn far more about from the Black Notebooks is the degree to which Heidegger participates in this well-established folkish form of anti-Semitism that is justified ontologically and justified philosophically as saying the German people belong amongst themselves. The Jews belong amongst themselves and should be separated from German society. It's not always or not necessarily an eliminationist anti-Semitism, one of the most extreme versions, obviously, that National Socialism embraces. But it is a separatist or segregationist anti-Semitism that calls for the removal of Jews from German society, and calls for a purified German belonging amongst themselves. And this is deeply, Heidegger exists not only personally in his personal politics, but philosophically is situated well within the space of this anti-Semitic thinking.
Another core element of your take on Heidegger is silence, which comes up in a few different places, but you start with his engagement with Greek philosophy, since he saw them in a special, or as having a special capacity to, quote, keep silent about silence. Can you unpack silence in Greek philosophy and the place it would take in Heidegger's developing thought?
Yeah, this is once again a very complex question, which I'll try to sort of answer in the most compact way possible. So to start answering the question, to a certain extent, it's important to understand that we're dealing with not so much with Greek philosophy per se, but with what Heidegger makes out of Greek philosophy. He's often considered a very unorthodox reader, especially of Aristotle and Plato, and he's often considered a very unorthodox and very peculiar translator of Greek philosophy. Nonetheless, that unorthodox approach, an unorthodox way of reading Greek texts, has been incredibly influential. So we could have a debate to the extent that this is, let's say, a viable portrayal of Greek thinking, or it's a highly peculiar portrayal of Greek thinking that's specific to Heidegger and is effectively a Heideggerian invention. We don't have to adjudicate that question now. It's not essential for us to decide, because what I'm interested in is how Heidegger works with the Greeks and what he makes of the Greeks and what role they play within his own thinking. And one of the core elements he defines in Greek philosophy is not only in Greek philosophy, but what he calls Greek Dasein, Greek existence, or Greek being, is also very similar to the Völkisch connection to the landscape and language. Is for Heidegger, the Greeks dwell essentially within their place, within their language, and in an essential connection to being. This connection is so essential that the kinds of questions that arise in modern philosophy for Heidegger don't even require being addressed or even being posed within the Greek existence, because it's so close, as Heidegger puts it, to its primordial essence. So there's sort of a strata of silence that exists within the Heidegger's conception of Greek philosophy, that his idea of the Greek philosopher doesn't have to pose the questions about their own being that arise in modern philosophy, because the Greek philosopher, Aristotle, exists so closely tied to their own being that these questions don't have to be posed. So in Heidegger's conception of Greek philosophy, it's the pedagogy or the training of philosophy is a training to silence. But there's a almost paradoxical circular element of it, that the training towards or to silence has to emerge out of silence. That you have to have a silent disposition already to be suitable for philosophical training in order to further cultivate the capacity for silence. So in his many readings of thinkers like Parmenides, of thinkers like Heraclitus, earlier readings of Aristotle or Plato, Heidegger describes philosophical thinking as a capacity for silence. And that, just to sort of reiterate, that capacity for silence has the duality of being a predisposition, but that predisposition enables you to acquire the philosophical capacity for silence, which involves not posing the questions that need not be asked, and also in a very Aristotelian mode, as we learn from Aristotle's from the Nicomachean Ethics, also letting the question taper off or dropping the question when it's reached the proper point of precision or the proper degree of exactitude. So philosophical in silence involves this duality.
One of the key elements in your approach to Heidegger is his analysis of language, so it's perhaps worth turning to Being and Time, which you say doesn't give us a thorough or complete philosophy of language that some other philosophers might give us, but he does lay some interesting groundwork by situating it in his existential analysis with themes like logos, discourse, and disclosure, and situating a particular understanding of silence within that. So, can you give us a basic sense of how language and silence function in his thought here?
Yeah, once again, a very complex question, and any discussion of being in time is a very complex discussion. But let me try to cut through to a few basic themes. One of the most interesting ways to look at the evolution of Heidegger's thinking is to look at the ways that he goes back and rereads Being in Time, and the ways that he, let's say, maintains certain aspects of Being in Time and continually revises other aspects of Being in Time. And with regard to language, I would say you can see him doing something or performing something in his philosophical language which exceeds the bounds of his own conceptuality. So what I try to identify with regard to silence, with regard to language, is a tension that runs throughout the work, that he's doing something with his own philosophical language that he's not yet able to describe. And I think that's an incredibly productive tension that he doesn't yet understand is operating within Being in Time at the time of writing. But as he goes back and rereads the text and revises his understanding of language, you can see him coming to terms with the gap between what he was doing and what he was able to overtly articulate. And what he is lacking in Being in Time is a way to describe what you might call the positivity of silence. The way to describe silence as something other than a lack, as a privation or something negative. That he's performing that in a certain way. So most famously in the call to conscience in Division 2 of Being in Time, which is a silent call. It says, as he famously writes, it says precisely nothing. But where he's struggling ontologically in his analysis of what he's actually doing is that he doesn't yet have a set of metaphysical or ontological concepts to describe that nothingness in positive terms. He struggles. He reaches a point of unexpressibility in his own thinking when he tries to articulate what is it that silence can do. And when we see what silence can do as a way of non-saying, as a way of actively not saying something, he's lacking the ontological framework to describe that. Right? So there's this tension that I think it's a very productive tension. I think it sort of drives him to go back to these questions in a way that he later finds in Aristotle's metaphysics, a set of terms through Aristotle's concept of steresis, which is often translated as privation, which he interestingly begins to translate as withdrawal later in his analyses. So Being in Time it's not that there's a failure to have a complete philosophy of language. What I think he would say about his own book is that it works with a well-formulated philosophy of language that even Heidegger himself can't yet describe or can't yet put words to. But he begins to over the next 5 to 10 years in the evolution of his thinking.
Yeah, jumping right off of that, in the wake of Being in Time, Heidegger would enter a transitional period between Being in Time and his entrance into National Socialist politics. It was in this period that he continued to produce some of his more celebrated works, like the 1929 book on Kant, his seminar, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. But you want to draw our attention to a much more obscure 1930 lecture on Aristotelian metaphysics, because it shows us some subtle but profound shifts in how Heidegger developed his ideas around a number of themes he detects, even if only implicitly, around things like gathering and unsayability. So, can you unpack some of the theoretical developments you see happening at this time?
Yeah, this is an absolutely fascinating period in Heidegger's, not only Heidegger's life, but also in Heidegger's thinking. So he publishes Being in Time in 1927. He acquires the long coveted professorial chair in Freiburg that he had sort of been aiming for his entire, in the early stages of his academic career. He feels like he's made it. He has the intellectual and financial security of a what's in German called the Lehrstuhl, the professorial chair. He's been able to return more or less to his beloved homeland in southwest Germany, and he begins to, let's say, unfold a very experimental set of analyses and experimental set of questions, with in an incredibly productive time. So you mentioned the Kant book, for example, which I don't necessarily address, but it's highly unorthodox reading of Kant, which garners a lot of almost enemies for Heidegger. There's the 1929-1930 Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, which enchanted Jacques Derrida, for example, in his final seminar, The Beast and the Sovereign, the second volume. And but amongst this almost sort of an inconspicuous Aristotle lecture on Aristotle's Metaphysics Theta 1 through 3. It's a very typical style of lecture that Heidegger gives. It's his public lecture course. It's part of his requirements as a professor that he gives a public lecture course every semester. And here he is reading Aristotle in a very slow, very detailed way. So on the one hand, you have this sort of speculative side of Heidegger in the Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, where he's exploring very broad, very experimental themes about the human relationship to animals, about the existence, the ontological nature of non-human animals. And on the other hand, you have him in his teaching performing this very slow, very precise, and also very peculiar reading of Aristotle, where you begin to see him draw together, or I argue, you begin to see him draw together abstract ontological themes from Being in Time, the analysis of language, which has been one of his major themes throughout the 1920s. And suddenly this takes on a new political valence. Things that hadn't yet been overtly invested with political importance suddenly take on a new political importance. Not in reference directly to any political movement that's happening, not in reference to National Socialism, but in the sense that language as an ontological phenomena, or language in its being, suddenly becomes invested with a new meaning that wasn't necessarily prevalent in Heidegger's thinking. And also, we see the emergence of a term that wasn't yet a vested or important philosophical term in Being a Time, and that term is gathering, which Heidegger derives from a series of translations from the Greek term logos, specifically from the verbal form, the infinitive verbal form of legein, which he translates as gathering. So an entire set of themes about speaking, reading, gathering together, culling together, emerge with a new ontological valence that begins to set the set of, let's say, the ontological distinctions of a a people gathered together in its language that in the process of gathering necessarily excludes, right? So Heidegger will, in his translations of Legein, which he'll compare it to things like harvesting, right, or culling, and he describes processes of harvesting the fruits that are of value and siphoning off or selecting off the ones that are of less value, right? So highly, sort of abstract, almost analogies about the nature of the process of gathering, harvesting, culling, cultivating, set up a sort of process for selection, selecting out, that aren't yet overtly invested with the kind of political meaning they could have at the time. Obviously, processes of eugenics, for example, will use the very same kind of language, but he establishes the framework in an abstract analysis of language as a process of gathering together, of, let's say, writing a poem as the process of selecting out the proper words while leaving off or leaving out the words that don't belong. Right? So we see him developing an analysis of what is not yet overtly political, but with the slightest sort of modifications can be vested, and also can be vested with deep political meaning, but also with a knowledge of not only the growing National Socialist movement at the time, but also of the folkish movement. We can already see how these echo themes developed by folkish thinkers. Specifically, I didn't mention in the previous question his colleague in Freiburg, Ludwig Ferdinand Claus, who was also a philosopher trained under Husserl, who is more overtly anti-Semitic in his writings in the 1920s, who reveals an extraordinary set of, let's say, affinities with Heidegger's thinking at the time.
Delving even further into Greek philosophy, you look at the role of various forms of silence in the ways they function in Greek thought. And we talked a bit about this earlier, but here later on you hone in on some very masculine forms of discipline and control. So before turning back to Heidegger, can you tell us a bit about the role silence here functions in Greek philosophy?
Yeah, so once again, we can raise the question, are we dealing with Greek philosophy, or are we dealing with Heidegger's idiosyncratic construction of an image of Greek philosophy? We can save that debate for a later time, but working within what Heidegger makes of Greek philosophy, and returning back to the themes of silence, what in specifically silence in philosophical training, that you have to have a silent disposition, which is further cultivated through philosophical training to lead you to a practice of silence as a philosopher. But the fundamental trait that one must have in order to reveal this philosophical disposition is a form of self-mastery, that you have control over yourself. So you just think about a text that is incredibly important for Heidegger's philosophical development, to look at the Nicomachean Ethics and look at the way that Aristotle's judgmental of things like gregariousness, or Aristotle's judgmental of the person who can't stop talking, or the way Plato portrays democracies as spaces of uncontrolled and unruly chatter, where the masses are talking too much. Just based on those brief examples, we can sort of think about the role that philosophical training has in cultivating silence, but that cultivation requires an underlying capacity for silence, which is within, for example, Aristotle's thinking, which is something that one is more or less endowed with. If one is not of the proper disposition, then one doesn't even have the underlying set of conditions to cultivate or train philosophical silence. So within, I would say, fundamentally within Greek thinking in as a broad distinction, this is a male capacity, right? It's doesn't mean that all men are endowed with it. There is, for example, within Aristotle or Plato as well, there's always a concern with overly feminine males who tend to also be considered overly chatty. So this is a particular capacity that is exclusively available to particular men, and a subset of those reveal the disposition necessary to take on the long training for further self-mastery within philosophical, as let's say, as what's required to become a philosopher and what has to be trained further to develop a philosophical practice. So silence is absolutely essential, at least in Heidegger's conception of Greek philosophy, as basically the fundamental trait required of a philosopher.
Yeah, to develop this a little bit more, Heidegger picks some of these themes up, particularly around you connected to the idea of attunement and the discipline required for philosophical pedagogy, as well as some key political questions he's thinking about at the time. So, can you unpack what Heidegger's picking up in the Greek thought and how he's developing it for his own purposes?
Yeah, so there's attunement is one term that is an entire that Heidegger uses quite frequently, beginning in the late 1920s, after being in time, even within being in time. It's part of an entire sort of metaphorics of harmony, of rhythm, of being in tune, of being in sync, and he develops this out, or I should say, he develops it within his readings of Aristotle, for example, especially his readings of the Nicomachean Ethics, that the attuned person, or the attuned man, who is capable of taking on philosophical thinking, or capable of being cultivated in philosophical thinking, is fundamentally in harmony with their surroundings, right? So he links us to what he'll call stillness. And to understand the stillness, it's not the lack of motion. It's instead motion that is in sync with one's surroundings. Right? So the man who has the philosophical disposition that can be cultivated within philosophical training, the disposition for silence, reveals a certain stillness that is in tune with the surroundings. This is a highly idealized version of the Greek man. It's a highly idealized, almost sort of humanistic reading of Greek existence. But it's also one that is tied with the kinds of image that's made of the German, or the German people, or the gathered together German collective within folkish thinking. So once again, if we were to read Heidegger in conjunction with his contemporaries such as Ludwig Ferdinand Claus, Walter Darré is another folkish thinker. I read him alongside. We would find within Darré and within Claus a very similar portrayal of the German people, of the German, most often the German man, who's a reticent character, who doesn't use unnecessary words, who has an underlying disposition for silence, who expresses himself as sparsely as possible, often just in grunts or in syllables. And in parallel, Heidegger is presenting an idealized version of the Greek man, specifically the Greek philosopher, as a similarly reticent, a similarly silent figure.
Turning back to the Greeks, in parallel with their account of masculinity is one of femininity, which you show carries a certain tension, if not an outright contradiction, simultaneously occupying a place of total silence and withdrawal, while also having occasional excessive outbursts. So before returning to Heidegger, can you give us a sense of how femininity functions in Greek thought here?
Yeah, so, and here I draw on a broad range of thinkers such as Lucy Irigaray and Jacques Derrida, a number of influential readings of the Greeks in post-war continental philosophy, that in opposition to this idealized Greek male who is under full control of his cultivated self-mastery, who is the sovereign over his own existence and specifically over his own voice and his own utterances, that's posited against this sort of unknowable, uncontrollable figure of the feminine within Greek philosophy, even within Greek politics. That there is, in opposition to the fully self-controlled, sovereign, masculine figure, there is this idea, this discourse of the feminine as completely beyond any sort of control, as we know in the Nicomachean Ethics, when Aristotle distinguishes the soul of the man from the soul of the woman, is that he claims, and also in De Anima, that women lack any form of self-control. That they have logos, but can control their own logos, right? So Heidegger is, I would say, perpetuates a long heritage of creating an idealized vision of the silent philosophical male that is implicitly posited against the uncontrollable feminine. And this is something that he occasionally gestures towards, but I think for the most part it operates as an unknowable aspect of his own thinking, or something that's unthinkable within the space of his own philosophical thinking. That he is perpetuating a long tradition of this this fundamental philosophical distinction, which I argue is, in many ways, what holds together the Western philosophical tradition, is the exclusion of the feminine, at times implicitly and at times explicitly. So I try to say, show the extent to which Heidegger is not only an anti-feminist thinker, but say the possibility of posing a feminist question is so foreign to his thinking that it's almost not even necessary to call him an anti-feminist thinker. It's the unthinkable, I would say, within Heidegger's thinking. And that is a way of sort of tracing Heidegger's lineage within the history of Western philosophy, and showing the extent to which his thinking fundamentally participates in a set of exclusions which I believe have held together in a certain way the history of Western philosophy.
Yeah, jumping right off of that and turning back to Heidegger more explicitly, you connect Greek femininity to a couple themes in Heidegger's thinking, such as forgottenness or being partially buried over. Femininity here is a sort of partial being, having a place in the polis that is no place. Can you unpack this element Heidegger develops here?
Yeah, so forgottenness is a major theme in Heidegger's thinking, and what has been forgotten for Heidegger is always doubly forgotten. It's not only forgotten, but its very forgottenness has been forgotten. And this applies, for Heidegger, this applies to the question of being. Being has been forgotten, and it's moreover been forgotten in its forgottenness. I tried to apply the same. This is very much coming out of Lucy Irigaray's readings of Heidegger and readings of the philosophical tradition more broadly speaking, is to situate the feminine as doubly forgotten within Heidegger's thinking, as a way to trace the fundamental exclusion that structures Heidegger's thinking, and of course not Heidegger alone. In this, to this extent, he's very much working within the established frameworks of 20th century Western philosophy. But one reason I seek to stress that, and one reason I seek to stress that within the analysis of Heidegger's politics, let's say his racism, just to put it more bluntly, is that this very same forgetting, or the feminine as belonging to but outside of the polis within Greek political thinking, that the feminine is structured as a disturbing element. It's the enemy within. Even the Greek man is constantly feeling threatened by this being that he's reliant upon. And a great amount of paranoia surrounds the fact that women control the bloodline in a certain way, and that Greek men need to find a way to take control over this. That this same sort of inside-out simultaneous status of being inside and outside the polis, that is to say, inside and outside the political community, we can find gestures of this within Heidegger's understanding of anti-Semitism, or not even just within Heidegger, that this is very much how Jews are portrayed in the most virulently anti-Semitic strands of folkish thinking, that the Jew is portrayed as an outsider who, through contingent factors of history, belongs within and connected to German society, but that the kind of resurgent nationalist political movements that are arising in the 1920s, their goal has to be to remove this outsider, this outside entity, either through force or through, effectively through force, most likely. But so there's, once again, the treatment of the feminine and the forgetting of the feminine, for me, reveals important affinities and important links to Heidegger's anti-Semitic politics.
Turning to the final chapter, you argue, along with what we were discussing in the first few questions, that Heidegger and others had a very romanticized vision of the Volk and their relationship to their surrounding land. And it was that vision that gave Heidegger a sense of a philosophical mission as a guide for the German people, in that National Socialism was a means to achieve that end. So can you explain Heidegger's sense of a mission here, and what role he thought Hitler and the National Socialists could play in helping him realize that mission?
Yeah, it's a very difficult, obviously very delicate question, and it gets to the core of Heidegger's politics. Right? So, in what way was Heidegger a National Socialist? I think to answer this question, it's best to begin with some of the fundamental facts. We know that Heidegger joined the party most likely in mid-March 1933. His party membership was issued on May 1st, 1933. But at that point, during the early months of Nazi rule, there was a massive backlog of applications for the party. So he probably filled out his application in mid-March, 6 weeks earlier than it's issued. Simultaneously, we know through documents contained in the German Federal Archives and elsewhere that he is participating in a local political movement led by professors in Heidelberg and Freiburg, both at the time in the state of Baden, important historical universities within the German university system. He's participating in a movement to preemptively lay a plan for Nazifying the university, even before the initial anti-Jewish measures had been passed by the party. The major anti-Jewish measures come in early April. So in mid-March, Heidegger is participating in a movement whose mission statement is, according to the internal documents, to ensure that German universities wear a German face. That's a paraphrase, but think it's essentially a quote from the document, that German university instructors are ethnically German. So he's already planning how to restructure his own university, Freiburg University, restructure it as a place cleansed of Jewish influence, which of course means removing Jewish professors and later enacting quotas on the number of Jewish students allowed to enroll. So the fundamental facts are, we have someone who is, we can see in his political life, is dedicated to an anti-Semitic nationalist movement. What is the nature of Heidegger's National Socialism is, on the one hand, there is this vulgar, highly personal power politics that he's involved in. We see him take on the rectorate, equivalent to being a university president, in April 1933. And we also can trace his maneuvers to try to take on a position of power within Berlin. I think it was, I would, if we had more time, I would work through the documents that show this. I think it was his goal to oversee the reform of German universities according to Nazi principles. I think he wanted to be something like, the Minister of Education, or to have an equivalent function within the Nazi state. So all of this is happening within Heidegger's life. Those are more or less sort of unimpeachable facts that we can prove through the documents. But simultaneously, we have a sort of philosophical vision of what National Socialism is. And it very much involves for him a return to a form of belonging to the soil, to the German race, of course, as well. He is a folkish racist, I would say, which means that he doesn't so much think of the German race as tied to the blood aspect of a blood and soil ideology, but he very much thinks about a form of racial belonging that is tied to the landscape, that the German people emerge out of this particular piece of land with all of its climactic aspects. The German language emerges in its modes of expression as an environmental phenomenon. This is classic folkish thinking. It's also classic racist and racial thinking that we could go back to as far, at least, as Kant. If we read Kant's Anthropology, we can find similar strains of thinking. And it's a conception of race and racial belonging that is in some ways more dominant within National Socialism than the newer forms of biological racism that tie the German people to the idea of blood. So for Heidegger, what has disturbed the German people's relationship to their landscape is, on the one hand, technology that, let's say, pulls us away from the place where we're existing, because it although it's something like an airplane which moves far too fast and disturbs our relationship to space and simultaneously our relationship to time. But another polluting element that is disturbing the Germans' relationship to their landscape, according to Heidegger, is the Jews. But these are also always tied together. One can speak about urbanization, one can speak about industrialization, and speak in an anti-Semitic code, which Heidegger is deeply immersed in, without having to overtly express anti-Semitic statements. So we already had, I would say, prior to the Black Notebooks, we already had, let's say, Heidegger's affinities to this anti-Semitic suspicion of technology, of progress, but the Black Notebooks give us the philosophical understanding of the ontological underpinnings of Heidegger's particular fidelity to these discourses. so he saw the National Socialism, just to wrap up the question, he saw National Socialism as a movement of cultural regeneration, of cultural renewal. He thought it would involve a renewed turn to the landscape while turning away from technology. But he was simultaneously always willing to make highly pragmatic compromises with whatever National Socialism actually was in its existence.
One key theme you bring up regarding Heidegger's Völkisch orientation is his connection with the land, most famously the Black Forest, where he himself spent much of his time in a small hut he built himself. So this theme comes up most explicitly in a small essay that he presented over the radio titled, "Why Do I Stay in the Provinces?" It's here and in other similar works that there's a certain idolization of rural life, where everyone, or at least everyone who belongs, quote unquote, is naturally attuned to certain rhythms. And there's no need to explain anything since everyone there is, quote, naturally a philosopher. So while it would be easy to read this as a simple, if romanticized view of rural dwelling to be contrasted with the hustle of urban life, you argue that there's a lot going on here politically in these pages as well. So can you unpack what you see going on here?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely fascinating short essay. So, why do I remain in the provinces? Why do I stay in the provinces? And it in many ways encapsulates the entire story of Heidegger's relationship to National Socialism. So, just to offer some context to the essay, as I mentioned, Heidegger reveals the ambition to try to take on a position of power in Berlin. He was very well situated within the region, within Freiburg, and within the region of Baden. He was well connected with local party politics, and I would say well informed of the situation, and probably could have remained rector in Freiburg or sort of a local influential figure for as long as he would have wanted to. But his ambitions were far more than just being in a small university in southwest Germany. He wanted proximity to power. He wanted proximity to Hitler, I would say. But he's not the only one who wants to. So he's part of a group of philosophers. Ernst Krieg and Alfred Bäumler are among them as well. Erich Jentsch. These are names that one might not have heard of, but were well-established figures at the time. Someone like Bäumler had a reputation equivalent to Heidegger's international and national reputation. Probably even was more well-known, not only within Germany, but abroad at the time. And all of these figures are vying for the position of what basically being the Führer, as you might say, of German philosophy. That the sort of mandates from above at the time were to have each of the disciplines informally under the leadership of a leader who sort of structured that discipline according to Nazi principles. And there's a lot of behind-the-scenes fighting that's going on around philosophy, which is one of the most important disciplines at the time. I mean, the fame of German universities in the 19th century comes from the discipline of philosophy. So the Nazis are very interested in who has control over philosophy and what they're doing. And Heidegger is one of the pretenders to the throne, vying for primacy over the discipline of philosophy. By, I would say, early to mid 1934, he's been pushed aside by a number of internal machinations. Basically, Bäumler and Krieg, Alfred Bäumler and Ernst Krieg and Erich Jentsch, his competitors, temporarily got together and sent a smear, an attack dossier to the Ministry of Education in Berlin, around a 35-page dossier, which is in the Prussian State Privy Archives in Berlin. And they persuade the Minister of Education to let's say, they basically persuade him that Heidegger is not a viable candidate for this position. And they managed, through their own temporary alliance, although they would soon become rivals themselves, they managed to push aside Heidegger. So his political ambitions, are national level political ambitions, are more or less thwarted by this time. And suddenly he begins to reinvent himself. Right? So due to this failure, his failure to negotiate a position of power, he begins to rethink his place as a professor within Nazi Germany. He portrays this in his own denazification his own denazification proceedings, as entering an apolitical phase of his life. I don't think there's any such thing as an apolitical professor at a Nazi university. I think we have to look at this as a second distinct phase in Heidegger's political career under National Socialism, and it's heralded by this short essay called "Why Do I Remain in the Provinces," which was read on the radio twice, once regionally and once in Berlin, and also published in the local Nazi Party organ. And this is the moment where Heidegger reinvents himself and portrays himself as the rooted man of the soil with close ties to the rural peasantry, with close ties to the farming community. The hut, as you mentioned, that he built himself was, he already had the hut, and he'd been spending a lot of time there already, but he suddenly, let's say in a public relations stunt, I don't think it's an overstatement to call it that, in a public relations stunt, he portrays himself in a new light through this short essay, where he shows himself as, this reticent character moving effortlessly within the space of the reticent peasants who were just going about their daily business of tending to the cows, tending to the harvest, mending the fences, worrying about their animals and their crops, that he belongs effortlessly and wordlessly among these people. And this is simultaneous to a sort of a reinvention of Heidegger, not as the attempted ideologue of National Socialism, but instead as an academic who produces the kind of work that is desired by the party and is safe to, not only safe for National Socialism, but is actually what they want. One of the things that the party wants from philosophy professors is to participate in what's called Heimatkunde, which to translate would be sort of homeland studies. So the short essay, Why Do I Stay in the Provinces, is, I would say, his first entry into showing the regime, I'm going to produce homeland studies. I'm going to produce the kind of scholarship and the kind of writing that is desired by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Culture. So it's a very rich 5-6 page text, which I think encapsulates so much about this second phase of Heidegger's, the second political phase of Heidegger during National Socialism. And it's a phase that I think is often overlooked by the scholarship, which tends to focus rightly on the rectorate, but at the cost of overlooking, the final 11 years of National Socialism.
To continue discussing or you connect this romanticization of rural life to some of Heidegger's developing thought throughout the 1930s, and that the Black Notebooks give us more access to, where he described culture as being in a process of slow but steady decay, and also described a hope that the decay would reach a tipping point past which things could perhaps get back on track. Heidegger often writes in these rather abstract and elusive terms, but you pull a variety of threads together between the notebooks, his previously published writings, and the events going on around him to paint a fairly damning picture of the relationship between his philosophical development and his politics. So can you unpack what the notebooks add to the picture of Heidegger here and how they help us better understand the implications of some of his previous writings?
Yeah, so I think that when the Black Notebooks were published, we had this initial wave of very, very, very good, but also often very quick reactions. And those tended to rightly focus on the identifiable passages where Heidegger expresses his terribly violent anti-Semitism. And then there was sort of, let's say, a period of going back to reread the notebooks. And I think we're still in that period of asking, well, what do they mean for Heidegger's thinking? So they're an incredibly rich resource, I think, to read alongside the other texts that he produces at the time. So that means the lecture courses that he gives, they're all published more or less by this point. We have access to thousands of pages of manuscripts, the contributions to philosophy, for example. And then we have access to his published works. And I think there's something quite peculiar that's happened within Heidegger scholarship, is that we take texts that are rightly famous, such as the Introduction to Metaphysics, or the Origins of the Work of Art. Probably Heidegger's most influential text in an interdisciplinary manner is the Origins of the Work of Art. It's produced, the conditions of productions of the Origins of the Work of Art are under fascism. This is a text written under fascism. And it is, to me, peculiar that this is often read in separation from that fundamental fact of its conditions of production. So I think one thing the Black Notebooks does is give us not only the impetus, but also a roadmap to go back and reread the texts from this time with an eye towards the fundamental fact that these are texts produced by a professor of philosophy working at a Nazified university. And not only working at a Nazified university, but flourishing philosophically at a Nazified university, and flourishing personally and professionally at a Nazified university. So I think the Black Notebooks give us a very good sense of that. And what they, for me, they show is help us to understand are the moves that Heidegger makes post 1934, after the rectorate, after the failure of his national political ambitions, to remake his fundamental philosophical questions in the image of what the party wants a philosophy professor to produce. So what do they want the philosophy professor to produce? They want their philosophy professors to participate, as I already said, in homeland studies. That usually means not only Germanic studies, that means regional Germanic studies. And they want you to participate in the sort of Philhellenism that was quite prevalent in Nazi Germany, right? So linking the Germans to the Greeks, a very active. And this is something that Hitler himself took quite seriously. So this is what we can see Heidegger doing. We watch him turn to the poet Friedrich Hölderlin in the early Nazi period. Hölderlin being, fitting within the demand for regional homeland studies. He's from Swabia, so he's Schwäbisch in German. And we also see Heidegger turning to a reliable body of Greek thinkers, many of whom he hadn't dealt with in detail before. So we can see, likewise, we can see how this public aspect of Heidegger's thinking, either his lecture courses or the public texts, beneath them is a strata in the Black Notebooks where he vests the very things he's doing in public. In private, he vests them with overt anti-Semitic resonances. So they're almost like I read them as an accompanying text, almost like a set of commentaries or addenda to his public philosophical work, where we can see that questions that he may not, even during the Nazi period, that he may not publicly vest with anti-Semitic resonances. In private, he does it. Right? And that's often read as a defense for Heidegger, that he doesn't publicly express anti-Semitism. But I think we have to remember that, keep in mind the public relation, that National Socialism was always very, very good and very concerned with public relations vis-a-vis the that's an international their international reputation, and it wouldn't necessarily have been desirable for a philosophy professor to or for a professor in general to publicly express anti-Semitism. But they're instead supposed to maintain a sort of level of reserve in their public pronouncements or in their writings that Heidegger remains loyal to. Right? So that Black Notebooks help us understand how good he was at navigating the demands, and not only the demands, but also the incentive structure of working within a fascist space of the Nazified German university.
Developing some of this a bit more, there's been a debate in the last few years around the kind of philosophical status of the Black Notebooks. So for some, the notebooks are this kind of final straw in continuing to offer patience or forgiveness to Heidegger, while others have stressed the notebooks element of the Black Notebooks to emphasize that while they may paint a damning portrait, they aren't philosophically substantial enough to warrant these sorts of enormous changes to our understanding of his philosophical thought. So, given your own orientation and what you've been developing for us, what is, in your opinion, the philosophical status of the Black Notebooks, and how should we read them in light of their genre, style, and their place in Heidegger's larger kind of complete works in his life?
Yeah, this is one of the questions that sort of plagued Heidegger scholarship in the last 6-7 years since it's been grappling with the Black Notebooks. I think it's essential to read them as philosophical texts, and I think it's been a failure among certain aspects of certain strands within Heidegger scholarship to confront them as philosophical texts. Their style is often indistinguishable from contemporary manuscripts. So I mentioned the contributions to philosophy. The contributions to philosophy are merely the most famous and earliest volume from a series of 6 or 7 manuscripts on the event, which now amounts to multiple thousand pages, which have long been read as announcing a sort of a second phase in Heidegger's thinking. This has been pursued since the publication of the Contributions to Philosophy I believe, in 1989. That's a well-established line within Heidegger scholarship. So the large portions of the Black Notebooks echo verbatim certain manuscripts from this series of manuscripts on the event. So at that level, they simply demand being read as philosophical texts. But we can also pull back and ask, well, what is it that we're doing as philosophers and also as thinkers who are interested in questions about the history of philosophy? And I insist that attending to the conditions of production of philosophical texts is always a philosophical question. And that's why, for me, it's essential to remember when we read any Heidegger text, where does it emerge from? It emerges from primarily a philosopher who worked within the German university system. That the German university system was the enabling condition of production of Heidegger's thinking. And that doesn't have to determine all aspects of our reading or interpretations of Heidegger, but I think it demands to be taken into account. Now, specifically when we're dealing with the era from 1933 to 1945, as I sort of said already, is that we have to remember that this is a thinker working within and flourishing within the Nazified fascist German university system. So the Black Notebooks are, admittedly, Heidegger's most autobiographical text in certain moments. So we find him being particularly autobiographical during the rectorate, that is from April 33 to 34. And then we find him once again, almost to close the circle, being very autobiographical in the very late months of the Second World War, and specifically during the time of his denazification. So from around May 45 until January 46. We have two intensely autobiographical moments where we have several hundred pages where he's reflecting on himself, his own treatment by the Denazification Commission, for example. And he's doing it in ways that are rare within Heidegger's writing. But I don't see, I'm failed to be persuaded by a justification that says, well, this is merely autobiographical and therefore not deserving of philosophical analysis. I would say, on the contrary, precisely because it's autobiographical, it's and because it's so unique within Heidegger's, thousands of the 100 or more volumes that we have of Heidegger, these pages are so unique that they're specifically demanding of philosophical analysis, because it tells us we learn so much about what he thinks about the institutions that make his thinking possible, and the historical shifts around, for example, let's say the German defeat in World War II, the failure of the National Socialist Project, the failure of Heidegger's ambitions within that National Socialist Project, and the occupation of post-war Germany. These are not arbitrary events. These are events that are tied, as I try to show, that are tied to very specific shifts in Heidegger's thinking. Right? Just to summarize that,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just to sort of reiterate, the challenge, I think, is that needs to happen in Heidegger studies, and much of it is, I don't want to imply that it's not, is to go back and reread these classic texts, not only from the Nazi period but also before and after, through the lens of the Black Notebooks, with the Black Notebooks as a sort of roadmap for rereading Heidegger.
Yeah, so in the epilogue of the book, you try to connect what you've developed throughout the book to some larger questions about the relationship between the humanities and politics. So part of the difficulty in addressing Heidegger's politics is not only the way in which Heidegger's thought was tied to a number of different cultural threads, but also has embedded in itself in a number of other fields throughout the humanities. No matter where we go today, if we want to do humanities scholarship, we are often working to some degree in his shadow. So simply no longer reading Heidegger isn't a serious option for us. So in closing, what do you think humanities scholars today should do with Heidegger? What questions need to be asked about his work, and what might it say about our own potential blind spots and potential for political complicity? Or to ask maybe a bit more bluntly and in a way that might force the question a bit more aggressively, what would it mean to denazify philosophy in the humanities more broadly today?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And these are the questions that drive me, and these are the questions that I always have in mind when dealing with Heidegger. I always try to read Heidegger not merely because of the curiosity around this one particular case, but because he offers us a lens to understand how the humanities respond to authoritarian and fascist regimes. It's easy to forget, and it often gets distorted, I would say, in popular perceptions of National Socialism, that when we go back and look at the complicity of the universities and complicity of the professoriate, we of course think about scientists, we think about weapons production, we think about gas production, the development of Zyklon B, for example. We think about the demographers who participated in the plans to colonize Eastern Europe. And all of that is, or the doctors who participated experiments in concentration camps or in the euthanasia program of mentally and physically disabled. And all of that is justified and all of that is essential. But we often forget that in 1933, when we had a fledgling fascist movement with a leader whose popular perception was still problematic, that as this movement needed to establish itself and needed legitimacy, the most important professors and the most important professors who were on the front lines of embracing National Socialism and letting it legitimacy came from the humanities. That on the forefront in 1933 were disciplines like history, philosophy, German studies, anthropology. But they responded to the call and played a very essential role in establishing the legitimacy of a movement that was desperately lacking legitimacy. In 1933, we're dealing with a movement that is looked at by the public as sort of a bunch of street thugs, as illegitimate, as anti-intellectual. And it's the humanities professors like Martin Heidegger, like the other philosophers I mentioned, Ernst Krieg, Alfred Bäumler, who help lend legitimacy to this movement. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we work, as we not only think about our own place within the discipline of philosophy, but think about the discipline of philosophy more broadly speaking. It's unlike, to think about post-war Germany, it did not denazify. Did German society at all denazify? The scholarship would say, well, it denazified in a very insufficient way. The denazification process across all 4 occupation zones was a relatively farcical process that made extraordinary compromises for the sake of German flourishing and economic vibrance, that it made those compromises in advance, especially the Allies. And philosophy and the universities participated and benefited from that more or less sort of amnesty that was given. So when we think about Heidegger, we have to think about how he benefited so immensely from a process of, let's say, willful non-denazification. And for how long, entirely dubious stories about Heidegger were allowed to still be expressed in legitimate scholarship, including the sort of myth that dominated Heidegger's studies until the Black Notebooks, which was that Heidegger was a devout Nazi, but not an anti-Semite. I mean, it's an absurd premise that somehow was allowed to dominate Heidegger's scholarship. So I think we have to ask, what enabled this? What allowed for Heidegger to be perhaps the most influential post-war philosopher within Western philosophy? He, I believe, is the most cited philosopher, just concretely speaking. So the question that drives me is to get to the question, what would it mean to denazify philosophy, would mean to not ask not only what enabled that, but what does it say about the discipline of philosophy that it did enable that? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. And I think that's an open question that philosophers, broadly speaking, especially those who work within the realm of influence of thinkers like Heidegger, we have to be vigilant to. I do think it's essential precisely because, I think it's essential to read Heidegger. We have to keep reading Heidegger precisely because we see the ways in which the humanities we see the ways in which the humanities can become the willing participants in fascist movements. And I think that raises a lot of questions about our own universities, our own institutions, and I think should constantly remind us, just as I ask, what are the conditions of production of Heidegger's thinking, that academics in whatever discipline should always be vigilant to the question, what are the conditions of production of my own work, of my own research? And what would it mean to, say, undertake a rigorous analysis of the political entanglements, the lines of complicity that we already exist in?
Yeah, that's an excellent, thoughtful way to end. So, as a final question, what are you working on now?
Yeah, so in the previous academic year, I was in Germany with a fellowship from the Volkswagen Foundation and Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And I was pursuing archival research on the discipline of philosophy in the Nazi era. The sort of guiding question for me is, what did it mean to be a philosopher active at a German university during the fascist period? And what did it mean to be a young academic who was trying to make their career? What did it mean to be a mid-career academic? What did it mean to be a well-established philosopher such as Heidegger, who's sort of in the middle, who's already a full professor by the time the Nazis come to power? So unfortunately, that work was disrupted by COVID, by the global disruptions that we're all coming to terms with. I do hope to make it back to Germany when the conditions allow, to return to sort of look at the careers of academics who openly embraced National Socialism, who tried to keep a distance from Nazism, but nonetheless made their career. What is it? So someone like Hans-Georg Gadamer, for example, what does it mean to get a professorship during the Nazi period, but somehow manage to come out of the Nazi period in 1945 and present yourself to the Allies and to the occupying forces as someone with a clean political past? Right? So I'm interested in these career trajectories of philosophers of all different political stripes who remained, who active at German universities during the Nazi period.
Excellent. So, Adam Knowles, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Stephen, for the thoughtful discussion, for the close reading of the book.